Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the least glamorous parts of the American Civil War, the food. Because while history books love showing heroic charges and dramatic generals staring into the distance, actual people pretended boiled mule tasted surprisingly decent. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Civil War introduced soldiers to many unforgettable experiences. Cannon fire tearing through forests, endless marches through mud, dysentery lurking behind every suspicious bucket of water, and of course hardtack, the legendary military biscuit that somehow managed to lower morale without technically violating any laws of war. Hardtack was the standard ration issued to soldiers on both sides of the conflict. It was made from flour, water and salt. That was the full recipe. No butter, no yeast, no flavour, and certainly no concern for the structural integrity of human teeth. Fresh bread spoiled too quickly during military campaigns, especially in the heat of southern summers. Armies needed food that could survive rainstorms, wagon crashes, careless quartermasters, and months of neglect. Hardtack solved all these problems by evolving into something closer to a medieval paving stone than actual bread. The crackers were baked until nearly all moisture disappeared, giving them an almost supernatural lifespan. Soldiers joked that hardtack could outlive the Confederacy, several presidents, and possibly Christianity itself. Archaeologists have found pieces over a century old that still looked edible, though edible may be using the term generously. The real problem was the insects. Weevils infested hardtack constantly. Tiny bugs burrowed into the crackers during storage, transforming every meal into an unpleasant surprise inspection. Veteran soldiers developed techniques for dealing with this. Some smashed the biscuits against trees or rifle butts to knock the insects loose. Others soaked them in coffee, until the bugs floated out like passengers abandoning a sinking ship. Less patient men simply ate the insects too. At a certain point, starvation turns disgusting into additional protein. Civilization is a fragile concept. One Union soldier described hardtack as sheet iron crackers. Another claimed they were teeth dullers. A Confederate soldier reportedly said they were old enough to vote. All three men were speaking with the exhausted sincerity of people who had just spent 20 minutes trying to chew lunch. Eating hardtack dry was considered a tactical mistake. Soldiers often soaked it in coffee, stew, or bacon grease first. Otherwise, biting directly into one carried a realistic possibility of losing several teeth and perhaps memories from childhood. At night around campfires, troops attempted to improve the crackers however possible. Some fried them in pork fat, others crushed them into soup. A lucky few added sugar and pretended they had invented dessert. This required imagination powerful enough to qualify for military promotion. Still, hardtack remained essential. Miserable as it was, the cracker kept armies moving across battlefields, forests, and ruined towns. Behind every famous Civil War painting stood thousands of exhausted soldiers, quietly chewing damp flour bricks while wondering if peace might eventually include vegetables. As the Civil War dragged on, both soldiers and civilians slowly discovered an uncomfortable truth about war. Heroic speeches do not fill stomachs. Flags are not edible, and patriotism, while emotionally inspiring, contains very few calories. This became especially obvious once supply lines collapsed and fresh food started disappearing from entire regions. Farms were burned, livestock stolen, railroads destroyed, and markets emptied. Before long, people began looking toward the forests with growing interest and increasingly dangerous optimism. At first, hunting seemed manageable. Deer, rabbits, and wild turkeys provided valuable meat for hungry families and exhausted soldiers. But after years of constant war, even the animals started disappearing. Forests near camps and towns were hunted relentlessly. Eventually, people lowered their standards. This is how squirrels became dinner. Squirrel stew appeared across both northern and southern camps, though it became especially common in struggling southern regions where shortages turned severe. Soldiers shot squirrels from trees whenever possible, often interrupting conversations mid-sentence the moment something furry moved nearby. A soldier might be discussing military strategy one moment and diving into bushes with a musket the next because dinner had just climbed an oak tree. Preparing squirrel meat required patience. The animals were small, bony, and difficult to clean properly. One squirrel rarely fed a full-grown man, meaning cooks usually needed several just to create one pot of stew. Entire dinners depended on the tragic downfall of what was essentially a collection of nervous woodland acrobats. The stew itself was simple. Meat boiled with onions, herbs, cornmeal, or whatever vegetables remained available. Sometimes the broth tasted surprisingly rich. Other times it tasted like warm forest regret. Still, hunger transforms perspective quickly. One Confederate soldier wrote that after weeks of poor rations, squirrel stew smelled better than a feast. This tells you less about squirrel quality and more about how horrifying military food had become by that stage of the war. Possums, raccoons, and wild birds also entered wartime kitchens. Rural Southerners already had experience cooking some of these animals, while many Northern soldiers reacted with visible alarm before eventually joining the meal anyway. Because starvation is history's greatest chef, it can make almost anything look appealing with enough time and suffering. And somewhere deep in the forests of wartime America, squirrels unknowingly became tiny, furry participants in one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 19th century, which is probably not how they imagined things would go. At the beginning of the Civil War, mules were among the most valuable animals in America. They hauled wagons, pulled artillery, carried supplies, and transported entire armies across impossible terrain. Generals depended on them, quartermasters guarded them carefully. Soldiers insulted them constantly, and eventually many of them ended up in stew pots. As the war dragged on and shortages worsened, especially in besieged southern cities, people became desperate enough to eat animals normally considered too valuable for slaughter. During long sieges like Siege of Vicksburg, food supplies collapsed so completely that civilians and soldiers started looking at work animals with deeply concerning levels of curiosity. Mules were tough animals. Unfortunately, this also described the meat. Accounts from the war describe mule meat as stringy, chewy, and stubborn beyond reason. Which makes sense considering these creatures spent most of their lives dragging cannons through mud, while being yelled at by exhausted men who had not bathed properly in 6 months. Cooking mule required patience. The meat was usually boiled for hours to soften it enough for human teeth to negotiate with safely. Families added onions, scraps of vegetables, or cornmeal whenever available. If nothing else existed, then it became plain boiled mule served with the emotional seasoning of despair. One Confederate civilian admitted that after enough hunger, mule meat eventually tasted fairly acceptable, which is one of history's least convincing restaurant reviews. At first, many people resisted eating them. Mules were essential transportation animals, and slaughtering them meant weakening supply lines even further. But starvation changes priorities rapidly. Once food disappeared entirely, practicality defeated sentiment. Children especially struggled with this adjustment. Many families had worked beside the same animals for years, before suddenly being forced to treat them as emergency rations. War has a cruel habit of destroying emotional boundaries along with physical ones. Some soldiers joked darkly that mules spent the entire war carrying the army, and then finished by feeding it too. It was grim humour, but humour nonetheless. People clung to jokes because the alternative was quietly staring into an empty cooking pot while artillery exploded nearby. And perhaps that is what makes these wartime meals so haunting. They were not exotic foods eaten for adventure or curiosity. Nobody proudly announced they had always dreamed of consuming military transportation livestock. People simply wanted to survive one more week, even if survival tasted vaguely like boiled saddle leather and sadness. If there was one thing Civil War soldiers loved almost as much as complaining, it was coffee. Union troops received large coffee rations throughout much of the war, and many soldiers treated the beverage with near-religious devotion. Men carried coffee beans in their pockets, brewed it beside campfires before sunrise, and drank it during marches, storms, and occasionally while cannon fire exploded nearby. A hot cup of coffee meant warmth, routine, and a brief reminder that civilization still technically existed. Confederate soldiers, however, faced a growing problem. The Union blockade slowly strangled Southern trade, making real coffee increasingly rare. Before long, Confederate civilians and soldiers were forced into one of history's saddest culinary experiments, inventing fake coffee. People roasted chicory roots, corn, peanuts, sweet potatoes, rye, acorns, and even burned bread crusts trying to recreate the flavour of actual coffee. The results ranged from barely tolerable to, "This tastes like a house fire dissolved in muddy water." Chicory became the most common substitute because it produced a dark, bitter drink that at least vaguely resembled coffee if consumed under ideal conditions. Those conditions usually included extreme exhaustion and lowered expectations. One Confederate soldier claimed chicory coffee was almost the same. Historians suspect this man had either lost hope entirely or not tasted real coffee in several years. Acorn coffee was another popular substitute. Acorns had to be roasted, crushed, boiled, and carefully prepared to remove bitterness. Even then, the final drink reportedly tasted like wet tree bark with emotional issues. Still, people drank it constantly. The routine mattered almost more than the flavour itself. Soldiers gathered around fires, sharing cups before marches. Families brewed substitutes in quiet kitchens while listening to distant artillery. For a few moments, the act of drinking something warm helped life feel normal again. Meanwhile, Union and Confederate soldiers occasionally traded coffee and tobacco during unofficial pauses between battles. Imagine standing across from someone who tried to shoot you yesterday and calmly exchanging caffeine supplies because both of you are too tired to continue pretending civilization has not collapsed. War creates very strange networking opportunities. Some Confederate diarists wrote entire paragraphs fantasizing about real coffee. Not victory, not glory, just coffee. Rich, steaming, beautiful coffee, which honestly feels deeply relatable, because once you have spent months drinking boiled peanuts pretending to be espresso, even disappointment starts looking luxurious. By the time the siege of Vicksburg tightened around the city, life had become a slow, exhausting collapse disguised as daily routine. Union forces surrounded Vicksburg for weeks, cutting off supplies and trapping thousands of Confederate soldiers and civilians inside. Artillery shells screamed overhead constantly. Buildings crumbled. Smoke drifted through the streets. And beneath all of it sat an even quieter enemy: hunger. At first, people survived on stored food. Rice, beans, salted meat, flour. But sieges are patient things. They wait calmly while cupboards empty themselves. Soon, livestock disappeared from the city entirely. Horses vanished. Mules vanished. Dogs and cats became increasingly difficult to find, which alarmed everyone for reasons they preferred not to discuss openly. Then came the rats. At the beginning of the siege, rats had been ordinary pests racing through alleyways and cellars. But starvation changes how people look at animals very quickly. Once food became scarce enough, the rats stopped being disgusting intruders and started becoming small, fast emergency chickens. Civilians trapped them inside homes and caves where families sheltered from artillery fire. Children learned not to scream when they saw one because screaming might scare away dinner. That is not a sentence anyone expects to write in peacetime. The rats were usually skinned, cleaned, and roasted over open fires. Some people boiled them into soup with rice or wild greens. Contemporary accounts suggest the flavour was unpleasant but manageable, which in wartime language translates roughly to, "I did not immediately cry while eating it." One resident joked darkly that the city's rats had become unusually fat from feeding on government grain supplies, making them technically the best-fed creatures in Vicksburg. Civil War humour often sounded like people trying to laugh while standing emotionally ankle-deep in despair. Meanwhile, civilians lived inside caves carved into hillsides to avoid Union bombardment. Entire families slept underground, surrounded by smoke, humidity, insects, and constant fear. Mothers cooked tiny meals over weak fires while children listened to shells exploding above them. Yet somehow routines continued. People still shared food. They still argued. They still traded recipes and complained about neighbours. Human beings cling to ordinary behaviour even while history collapses around them. And perhaps that is the strangest part of siege warfare. Not that people ate rats, but that after enough hunger and exhaustion, eating rats slowly became just another Tuesday. As the Civil War entered its later years, shortages across parts of the Confederacy became catastrophic. Railroads were damaged, farms destroyed, livestock depleted, and entire towns struggled to feed themselves. In some areas, proper meals disappeared almost entirely, and this is where history becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because eventually, people began boiling leather. Not as a joke, not as some strange frontier recipe, Actual leather. Shoes, belts, harnesses, scraps of animal hide. Anything remotely chewable after enough boiling water and enough desperation. The process was miserable. Families cut leather into strips and boiled it for hours, trying to soften it enough to eat. The heat extracted tiny amounts of grease, gelatin, and whatever traces of animal fat remained trapped inside the material. Nutritionally, it offered very little. Emotionally, it offered even less. Imagine gathering your family around the dinner pot while quietly pretending the old boot floating inside counts as a meal. Civil War diaries describe people chewing softened leather for long periods because it remained tough, even after hours of boiling. Some compared the texture to wet rope. Others claimed it tasted like nothing at all, which may have been the leather trying to apologize. Children suffered especially badly during these shortages. Parents often gave the smallest portions to themselves, while trying to preserve food for younger family members. Mothers stretched soups with scraps, watered down cornmeal, and invented meals from almost nothing. One southern woman wrote bitterly that her family had reached the point where the kitchen contains only imagination, which is both tragic and surprisingly poetic considering the circumstances. Salt became precious too. People scraped old barrels or reused cooking grease repeatedly, because replacing ingredients was nearly impossible. Entire households revolved around finding tiny ways to survive one more week. And yet even during starvation, people still tried maintaining dignity. Families continued setting tables properly. Some dressed for meals despite eating almost nothing. Civilization clung stubbornly to routine, even while dinner slowly transformed into boiled accessories. There is something haunting about that image. Not battlefield glory, not dramatic cavalry charges, just exhausted civilians sitting quietly around weak candlelight, chewing softened leather while pretending tomorrow might somehow improve. Wars are often remembered through generals and maps, but starvation reveals history at its most human and most frightening, because eventually hunger strips away pride, comfort, and illusion, and in the end, the human body does not care whether dinner once held your pants up. Not every strange Civil War food came from total desperation. Some existed because armies needed something cheap, portable, and filling enough to keep exhausted soldiers walking for miles through mud while carrying half their body weight in equipment. This is how parched corn became one of the war's most common survival foods. The recipe was brutally simple. Corn kernels were roasted in iron pans until dry and slightly browned. Soldiers then carried handfuls in pockets or cloth bags during marches. It required no cooking afterward, spoiled slowly, and could be eaten while moving. Convenient, yes. Pleasant, absolutely not. Parched corn had the texture of tiny gravel, mixed with emotional disappointment. Soldiers chewed it for long stretches, simply because there was often nothing else available. Some men softened the kernels in water first. Others crushed them into rough meal, or mixed them into weak soups. Most simply accepted that dinner now sounded like horse feed. Still, the food served its purpose. During long campaigns, especially in the south where supply shortages worsened constantly, parched corn provided quick calories without slowing armies down. A soldier could march all day while chewing dry kernels from his pocket like a deeply exhausted farm animal. And honestly, by the middle of the war, many soldiers already smelled close enough to livestock that the distinction was becoming academic. Corn became essential throughout the Confederacy because wheat flour grew scarce. Families baked cornbread constantly, though wartime cornbread often lacked milk, eggs, or proper seasoning. Sometimes it was little more than cornmeal mixed with water and cooked into dense cakes. One Confederate soldier joked that if he survived the war, he planned never to look at corn again for the remainder of his natural life. This was an ambitious goal in 19th century America. Parched corn also carried emotional significance for marching troops. Men passed handfuls between friends during exhausting movements through forests and fields. Around campfires, soldiers complained endlessly about rations, while continuing to eat them anyway, because starvation remained an even less attractive option. Many soldiers dreamed constantly about real meals from home. Roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie, thick stew. Their letters described food with almost romantic intensity. Hunger transformed ordinary dinners into sacred memories. Meanwhile, reality remained several handfuls of dry, roasted corn, consumed beside muddy roads, while rain leaked into boots. The The Civil War had a remarkable talent for reducing human existence to very basic priorities. Stay warm, keep marching, and try not to crack a tooth on dinner. If hardtack was the Civil War's most infamous bread product, then salt pork was undoubtedly its most aggressive meat. Both Union and Confederate armies relied heavily on barrels of salted pork because fresh meat spoiled quickly during long campaigns. Refrigeration did not exist in military camps, and dragging live pigs behind marching armies presented several logistical complications, including noise, smell, and the possibility that your emergency food supply might wander into a river. So pork was packed into barrels with enormous amounts of salt and shipped across the country. Enormous amounts. Modern doctors would likely faint just reading the recipe. The pork often sat in storage for months before reaching soldiers. By the time barrels were opened, the meat appeared pale, greasy, and exhausted. Some pieces floated in thick, salty brine, like they had been preserved for an archaeological project instead of dinner. Soldiers usually boiled the meat repeatedly before eating it, hoping to remove enough salt to prevent immediate dehydration. Even then, many described the flavour as overwhelming. One Union soldier claimed eating salt pork felt like swallowing the Atlantic Ocean wrapped in pig fat. Another described the smell during cooking as capable of waking the dead and deeply offending them. Still, soldiers depended on it constantly. The fat provided valuable calories during exhausting marches and freezing nights. Men fried pieces in skillets, mixed them into beans, or crumbled small amounts into stews to improve flavour. And by improve flavour, they generally meant make this edible without openly weeping. Sometimes the meat spoiled despite the salt. Soldiers learned quickly to cut away suspicious sections or simply close one eye and trust fate. Civil War armies lost enormous numbers of men to disease already, so perhaps a questionable piece of pork no longer seemed especially alarming after a certain point. Camp cooks became masters of improvisation. A decent cook could transform salt pork, beans, onions, and desperation into something almost comforting after a long march. A bad cook could create meals remembered by survivors for decades afterward, with visible emotional pain. One Confederate diarist wrote that he had become so tired of salt pork that he dreamed nightly of vegetables. Not victory, not peace, cabbage. That may be the most honest wartime statement ever recorded, because eventually the glamour disappears from war. The speeches fade, the flags become dirty, and history starts smelling less like glory and more like boiling pork grease drifting through damp camps, while exhausted men scrape burnt meat from dented pans under cold rain. As the Civil War dragged into its third and fourth years, armies developed a skill rarely mentioned in heroic battlefield paintings: stealing food with astonishing efficiency. Officially, this practice was called foraging, which sounds respectable, organised, and vaguely outdoorsy. In reality, it often involved thousands of hungry soldiers entering farming regions and causing every nearby chicken to experience immediate existential terror. Armies consumed enormous quantities of food every single day. Men needed bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, and livestock just to keep moving. Supply lines constantly failed, wagons broke down, railroads were destroyed, and commanders faced an unpleasant reality. If food could not reach the army would simply eat whatever surrounded it. This became especially devastating during campaigns through southern farmland. Union troops marching under William Tecumseh Sherman became infamous for stripping regions bare during their advance through Georgia. Soldiers took chickens, pigs, cows, sweet potatoes, corn, fruit preserves, and occasionally entire meals already cooling on kitchen tables. Farmers buried flour underground or hid livestock deep in forests. But experienced troops became surprisingly talented at discovering hidden supplies. Some soldiers could apparently locate a concealed ham, with abilities bordering on supernatural. One Southern woman complained in her diary that Union soldiers left nothing behind but frightened children and confused cats. The cats, to their credit, were probably also wondering where the chickens had gone. Foraging parties often operated ahead of the main army. Men spread across countryside roads searching barns, smokehouses, and gardens. Sometimes they traded politely with civilians. Other times they simply took what they wanted and continued marching. This created enormous resentment among civilians already struggling to survive. Yet soldiers themselves were usually hungry too. Many had marched for days eating little besides hardtack and salt pork. Fresh eggs or vegetables felt luxurious after weeks of military rations. One Union soldier described finding apples during a march with the emotional intensity of a religious experience. And honestly, after 6 straight months of chewing preserved meat and insect-filled crackers, a fresh apple probably did look like divine intervention. The strange thing about wartime foraging is how quickly it normalized. Soldiers stopped seeing farms as homes and started seeing them as supply depots with emotional attachments attached. War changes perspective like that. A peaceful countryside slowly transforms into inventory, and somewhere across the south, thousands of chickens spent the Civil War discovering that neutrality was not being respected by either side. As shortages spread across the south, civilians became experts at culinary improvisation. Entire kitchens turned into experimental laboratories, where exhausted cooks stared at random ingredients and tried convincing themselves they could still produce dinner. This is how peanuts entered the Civil War survival menu in increasingly creative ways. Peanuts were cheap, widely available in parts of the South, and packed with protein. Unlike many wartime foods, they also had the rare advantage of tasting reasonably pleasant before being transformed into something tragic. People roasted them, boiled them, ground them into paste, mixed them into bread, and even turned them into soup. Peanut soup became especially common in areas where meat had become scarce. The dish usually combined crushed peanuts with broth, onions, herbs, and sometimes milk if a family was fortunate enough to still own a cow that had not already been eaten, stolen, or emotionally broken by artillery fire. Surprisingly, many people genuinely enjoyed it. This immediately made Civil War soldiers suspicious, because enjoyable meals had become deeply uncommon by this stage of the conflict. One Southern diarist admitted that peanut soup was almost luxurious compared to standard wartime meals, which says less about the greatness of peanut soup and more about how horrifying everything else had become. Peanuts also appeared in Confederate coffee substitutes, since real coffee beans were increasingly impossible to obtain due to Union blockades. Southerners roasted peanuts and brewed them into dark, bitter drinks that vaguely resembled coffee under generous lighting conditions. The results were inconsistent. Some batches tasted nutty and tolerable. Others tasted like someone had filtered hot water through burnt furniture. Still, people drank it anyway because habits matter during crises. Morning drinks around the fire gave families and soldiers a small sense of normality while the world collapsed outside. Children often gathered peanuts by hand from fields after harvests, helping families stretch food supplies further. Women traded recipes constantly, searching for new ways to disguise shortages from exhausted relatives. Entire communities survived through collective improvisation and shared stubbornness, and that may be one of the most remarkable parts of wartime cooking. Human beings will stare directly into famine and still say things like, "Perhaps if we add onions this time." Civilization, apparently, is held together largely by people refusing to stop seasoning soup, even when the soup itself is made from crushed peanuts, weak broth, and optimism barely held together with a wooden spoon. By the later years of the Civil War, soup became less of a recipe and more of a survival strategy. In towns suffering shortages, and in military camps where supplies arrived irregularly, people learned to stretch tiny amounts of food into meals large enough to feed entire families or groups of soldiers. The result was often a thin, watery concoction containing whatever ingredients happened to exist within a 10-mile radius. A typical wartime soup might include beans, onion peels, wilted greens, scraps of cornmeal, tiny pieces of salt pork, and enough water to convince everyone involved that volume somehow compensated for quality. Sometimes it did, at least temporarily. Large iron pots simmered constantly over campfires and kitchen hearths. Women stirred them carefully while calculating how to make 1 carrot emotionally support 6 people. Soldiers gathered around cooking fires holding dented tin cups, hoping tonight's soup might contain an actual piece of meat instead of simply memories of meat. One Confederate soldier joked that his stew contained 1 bean for every 3 men. Another claimed he once chased a floating potato chunk around his bowl for several minutes before another soldier stole it. Civil War dining could become surprisingly competitive. Wild plants were often added to soups as filler, Dandelion greens, pokeweed, wild onions, and other forage plants appeared regularly. Experienced cooks knew which plants were safe. Less experienced cooks occasionally transformed dinner into a chemistry experiment with unfortunate consequences. Still, people kept improvising because there was no alternative. Soup offered one major advantage during famine. It could make small amounts of food feel larger. A handful of beans looked far more encouraging once floating inside a steaming pot. Even weak broth provided warmth and comfort during cold nights. And psychologically, shared meals mattered enormously. Families gathered around soup pots, not because the meals were impressive, but because eating together helped preserve some sense of normal life. Children still argued over portions. Soldiers still complained dramatically about flavour. Human routines continued stubbornly, even while the country tore itself apart. There is something strangely moving about that. Outside, artillery shook windows, and armies marched across entire states. But inside kitchens and camps, exhausted people still debated seasoning and guarded potatoes like priceless treasures. Perhaps civilization survives not through grand speeches or military victories, but through ordinary people continuing to stir soup while history collapses around them. Though admittedly, civilization would probably survive more comfortably with slightly larger potatoes. One of the strangest things about Civil War cooking was not simply the shortages. It was the determination people showed in pretending the shortages were not happening. Human beings can tolerate hardship surprisingly well. What they truly miss is familiarity, comfort, routine, the small ordinary pleasures that remind them life has not completely unraveled into smoke and misery. Which explains why, during the Civil War, people began making fake apple pie without apples. Yes, entire desserts built around the ambitious lie that crushed crackers could somehow become fruit. Apples became difficult to obtain in many regions during the war, especially in areas suffering heavy shortages. But families still craved desserts and familiar meals, so cooks improvised. They crushed hard crackers or stale bread, mixed them with sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, lemon flavouring when available, and baked the mixture inside pastry crusts. Remarkably, it sometimes worked. Or at least it worked well enough that exhausted, hungry people could close their eyes and briefly imagine happier circumstances. The spices carried most of the responsibility. Cinnamon and nutmeg filled kitchens with comforting smells associated with home, holidays, and normal life. The human brain, apparently, is willing to forgive an extraordinary amount of deception if enough cinnamon is involved. Children especially loved these desserts because they offered temporary escape from wartime reality. For a few minutes, dinner no longer felt like survival. It felt almost ordinary again. Almost. One woman admitted in her diary that her mock apple pie looked convincing in candlelight, which is perhaps the most polite 19th century way possible to say, nobody inspected it too carefully. Other substitute foods appeared too. Cakes made without eggs, coffee without coffee, bread with barely any flour. Entire recipes became performances of optimism, held together by seasoning and collective denial. And honestly, there is something oddly admirable about it. Even during war, people still wanted dessert, not because dessert was essential for survival, but because it reminded them they were still human beings instead of merely frightened mouths trying to consume calories before tomorrow arrived. Meanwhile, soldiers wrote home fantasizing about proper meals with emotional intensity usually reserved for lost romance. Men described pies, cakes, biscuits, and roasted dinners in astonishing detail. Hunger transformed ordinary food memories into sacred visions. And somewhere in a dim wartime kitchen, a tired cook carefully sprinkled cinnamon over cracker filling, while silently hoping nobody asked too many questions about the missing apples. Because sometimes survival is not about convincing people that dinner is good. It is simply about convincing them dinner still feels like home. As food shortages worsened throughout the Civil War, many families turned increasingly toward forests, fields, and roadsides in search of anything edible. Gardens had been destroyed, livestock stolen, and markets emptied. Nature became one of the few remaining grocery stores still technically open for business. This led to a surge in foraging for wild fruit. Blackberries, wild grapes, pawpaws, mulberries, and persimmons became valuable additions to wartime diets, especially in the South where shortages grew more severe each year. Entire families wandered through woods, collecting berries in baskets, while keeping one nervous eye on nearby troop movements. Because nothing says historical tension quite like gathering fruit while hearing distant cannon fire somewhere over the hills. Persimmons became particularly important. Once fully ripe, the fruit turned soft and sweet, making it useful for breads, puddings, and simple desserts. Persimmon bread appeared regularly in wartime kitchens, usually mixed with rough cornmeal and baked into dense loaves. When prepared correctly, it actually tasted fairly pleasant, which was becoming suspiciously rare in Civil War cuisine. However, there was one important problem. Unripe persimmons were essentially biological warfare. Eating one too early produced an unbelievably dry, bitter sensation that instantly removed all moisture from the human mouth and possibly parts of the soul. Soldiers and children repeatedly ignored warnings anyway, because human beings have always possessed remarkable confidence in their ability to outsmart fruit. They could not. One Confederate soldier wrote that biting into an unripe persimmon made his mouth draw itself shut like a purse. Another claimed it felt like licking hot dust wrapped in bark. Still, people kept gathering them because calories mattered more than dignity. Wild berry picking also became emotionally important for civilians. Children searched hedgerows for blackberries, while mothers preserved fruit in jars whenever sugar could still be found. For a few hours, these activities allowed families to focus on ordinary routines instead of war. Soldiers foraging through countryside regions often stopped to eat berries directly from bushes during marches. Diaries describe exhausted men suddenly abandoning all military discipline the moment someone spotted ripe fruit nearby. Entire armies briefly transformed into very hungry raccoons. And honestly, after months of salt pork and hardtack, fresh berries probably tasted like food sent directly from heaven itself. The Civil War constantly forced people into uncomfortable compromises between survival and normality. Yet even during hunger and destruction, they still searched for sweetness wherever they could find it. Sometimes in bread, sometimes in berries, and sometimes in the dangerous optimism of eating suspicious fruit before it was ready. If ordinary military rations were miserable, then prison camp food belonged to an entirely darker category of suffering. Civil War prison camps on both sides became overcrowded, unsanitary, and desperately undersupplied as the conflict dragged on. Thousands of prisoners lived behind crude fences with little shelter, contaminated water, rampant disease, and food portions so small they barely qualified as meals. At places like Andersonville Prison, hunger became a constant physical presence. Prisoners woke hungry, worked hungry, argued hungry, and fell asleep hungry. After enough time, starvation stopped feeling temporary and became the entire structure of daily life. The standard ration often consisted of coarse cornmeal, tiny scraps of meat, weak soup, or mouldy bread. Sometimes prisoners received beans. Sometimes they received nothing substantial at all. Men fought over crumbs with the exhausted desperation of people whose bodies had begun consuming themselves from the inside. One former prisoner described the camp bread as a grey lump of misery. Another claimed the soup looked like rainwater after a horse passed through it. Neither man appeared impressed with the menu. The meat, when available, was frequently spoiled or filled with gristle. Prison cooks worked with terrible ingredients under terrible conditions, feeding thousands of starving men, using little more than giant iron pots and fading optimism. As starvation worsened, prisoners trapped rats, frogs, insects, and stray animals whenever possible. Tiny pieces of food became priceless. Men traded buttons, blankets, knives, or family keepsakes for extra scraps. Hunger transformed value completely. A potato could become more important than money. A spoonful of beans could start arguments. Entire conversations revolved around imaginary meals from home. Prisoners described roast dinners, pies, fresh bread, butter, apples, and coffee in extraordinary detail, almost like religious visions shared around campfires. The human brain clings desperately to memories of comfort when reality becomes unbearable. Disease spread rapidly through these camps because malnourished bodies could no longer resist infection. Men grew skeletal. Clothing hung loosely from collapsing frames. Diaries describe prisoners staring constantly at food carried by guards with the hollow intensity of starving animals. And yet even inside these horrific camps, humanity survived in strange little ways. Men still shared food with weaker prisoners. Friends saved crumbs for sick companions. Some prisoners joked darkly about the meals simply because laughter remained one of the few things starvation could not fully confiscate. War destroys bodies quickly, But hope usually starves much slower. When people imagine the Civil War today, they usually picture dramatic battlefields, smoke drifting across forests, generals on horseback, and enormous flags waving heroically in the wind. History paintings rarely include exhausted soldiers quietly arguing over insect-filled crackers beside a pot of squirrel stew. But perhaps they should, because the strange foods of the Civil War reveal something deeply human about the conflict that battle maps often cannot. Behind every famous charge and political speech stood millions of ordinary people simply trying to survive another day with whatever food remained available. And sometimes that food was boiled leather, or roasted rats, or coffee made from burned peanuts and optimism. The war transformed kitchens into battlefields of their own. Mothers stretched tiny portions into meals for entire families. Soldiers marched for miles, fueled by hardtack and stubbornness. Children learned the difference between ripe and unripe persimmons through personal suffering. Entire communities survived through improvisation, shared recipes, and the refusal to completely surrender normal life. Even dessert became an act of resistance. Mock apple pie without apples may sound ridiculous today, but those recipes represented something important. People still wanted comfort. They still wanted birthdays, warm bread, sweet smells from the oven, and familiar routines around the dinner table. War could destroy railroads and cities, but people stubbornly continued trying to season soup properly. That persistence matters. One of the strangest truths about history is that human beings adapt incredibly fast. Conditions that once seemed impossible slowly become routine. A man who once complained about stale bread could eventually find himself eating mule meat beside a campfire while sincerely calling it not bad. Civilization is thinner than we like to admit. Remove enough comfort, enough stability, enough food, and people begin making meals from whatever exists nearby. Yet at the same time, they continue telling jokes, sharing food, writing recipes, and dreaming about future dinners. Perhaps that is why these wartime meals remain so fascinating, not because they were exotic or adventurous, but because they show ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship with a strange mixture of misery, creativity, humour, and resilience. And honestly, the dry humour makes sense. If your dinner contains insects, your coffee tastes vaguely like burnt fence posts, and your bread could potentially damage masonry, then laughter becomes less of a luxury and more of a survival mechanism. The Civil War ended long ago. The armies disappeared. The camps emptied. The battlefields grew quiet again. But somewhere in history's memory, a tired soldier is still sitting beside a smoky fire, dipping hardtack into weak coffee and wondering if peace might finally include vegetables. Before Rome controlled the Adriatic Sea, before Roman governors barked orders from marble forums, and before Roman tax collectors perfected the ancient art of ruining everyone's mood, the eastern coast of the Adriatic belonged to the Illyrians. Their lands stretched along harsh mountains, rocky cliffs, thick forests, and narrow coastal harbours where ships vanished as quickly as they appeared. It was a beautiful region, provided you ignored the constant raiding, tribal warfare, and occasional kidnapping. Among these fierce tribes rose a woman who would terrify Roman merchants and provoke one of the Republic's first overseas wars. Teuta. The Illyrians were not one unified empire. They were a collection of tribes constantly balancing alliances, rivalries, and blood feuds that could begin over territory, trade routes, or someone insulting another man's goat 30 years earlier. Yet one tribe, the Ardii, had become dominant under King Agron, Teuta's husband. Agron transformed Illyria into a serious regional power through military campaigns and, most importantly, naval strength. His ships ruled much of the Adriatic coastline. Fast Illyrian vessels known as lembi could move quickly through narrow waters, strike merchant ships, and disappear into hidden coves before larger enemies could react. To the Greeks and Italians sailing nearby, the sight of Illyrian sails on the horizon usually meant one thing: today was about to become significantly worse. Then Agron died suddenly after a victory celebration. Ancient historians claimed he drank himself to death following military success. It was a remarkably ancient way to die. Conquer your enemies in glorious battle, survive countless spears and storms, then lose the war against enthusiastic wine consumption. After his death, Tota became regent for the young Prince Pinez. Many neighbouring rulers likely expected her to remain quiet and cautious. Instead, she expanded Illyrian aggression across the Adriatic. Under her rule, piracy increased dramatically. But from the Illyrian perspective, this was not simple banditry. Raiding enemy merchants had long been part of coastal warfare and economic survival. The line between pirate and naval warrior in the ancient world was often extremely thin, usually about the thickness of a bronze coin. Greek cities complained constantly about attacks. Merchants feared Illyrian ships. Roman traders began suffering losses as well. At first, Rome paid little attention. The Republic was busy elsewhere and viewed the Adriatic as distant business. That indifference would not last long. As regent of the Ardeian kingdom, Teuta inherited more than a crown. She inherited a fragile network of tribes, ports, warriors, and ambitious captains who respected strength above all else. In Illyria, rulers did not survive long by appearing uncertain. A weak monarch invited rebellion the way an unattended fish invited seagulls, loudly and immediately. Tota understood this well. Rather than reducing military activity after Agron's death, she continued his aggressive policies across the Adriatic. Illyrian ships raided merchant vessels, attacked coastal settlements, and pressured neighbouring Greek colonies that had grown wealthy through trade. The Adriatic Sea became increasingly dangerous for anyone carrying valuable cargo and insufficient armed guards. Merchants sailing these waters likely developed the ancient equivalent of checking the locks 3 times before bed. The Illyrian fleet relied on speed. Their lembi were small, light ships designed for rapid strikes. They could move along rocky coastlines, vanish into hidden inlets, and surround slower merchant vessels before help arrived. Roman and Greek traders often sailed heavy cargo ships filled with grain, wine, ceramics, or silver. The Illyrians viewed them less as untouchable commercial vessels and more as floating opportunities sent kindly by the gods. Tota also strengthened Illyrian influence over nearby coastal cities. Some settlements paid tribute willingly out of fear. Others resisted and suffered attacks. Greek colonies along the Adriatic repeatedly sent complaints to larger powers, warning that Illyrian piracy was spiralling out of control. But piracy in the ancient world was strangely common. Nearly every maritime power condemned it publicly, while quietly benefiting from it whenever convenient. Moral outrage tended to depend heavily on whose ships were being robbed. Eventually, Roman merchants became targets too. At first, Rome treated the matter as an annoyance rather than a crisis. The Republic had recently emerged victorious from difficult wars in Italy, and was focused on securing its growing territory. The Illyrians seemed distant, tribal, and relatively unimportant compared to larger Mediterranean rivals. Rome had not yet begun its great expansion across the sea. Still, Roman traders demanded protection. Complaints multiplied in the Senate. Reports described captured ships, stolen cargo, and attacks on allies. Roman pride, always delicate despite pretending otherwise, began to suffer. So Rome decided to send ambassadors to Teuta's court. Officially, they came to negotiate peace and demand an end to piracy. Unofficially, they arrived with the confidence of men already accustomed to giving orders to half the known world. That would prove to be a mistake. The Roman ambassadors arrived in Illyria, carrying the full confidence of the Republic behind them. Rome was growing rapidly in power, and its officials had begun speaking to neighbouring states less as equals and more as future problems awaiting correction. Diplomacy in the Roman style often resembled a polite warning delivered by someone already reaching for a sword. When the envoys reached the court of Teuta, they demanded that Illyrian raids against Roman merchants stop immediately. Rome expected compensation for stolen goods, punishment for pirate captains, and guarantees that Adriatic trade routes would remain safe. To the Romans, these demands probably sounded perfectly reasonable. To Teuta, they sounded like foreigners attempting to dictate how Illyria governed its own waters. Ancient historians recorded that Teuta responded calmly at first. She reportedly explained that piracy was not directly controlled by the crown in the way the Romans imagined. Illyrian captains operated independently, and raiding at sea had long been accepted as part of local custom and warfare. In other words, she essentially told Rome that Adriatic piracy was less a crime and more a deeply unfortunate cultural hobby. The meeting deteriorated quickly. One Roman ambassador, according to historical accounts, lost patience and openly threatened the queen. He declared that Rome had a habit of correcting the bad customs of other nations. It was exactly the kind of statement guaranteed to inflame tensions. Few rulers enjoy being lectured inside their own court by foreigners who arrived uninvited, and immediately began explaining civilization to everyone. Tutor was furious. Whether from insult, anger, or political calculation, she allowed the ambassadors to leave under dangerous conditions. On their journey home, one of the Roman envoys was attacked and killed, likely by Illyrian forces or pirates connected to the kingdom. Ancient sources disagree on the precise details, but the result was the same. A Roman ambassador was dead. This transformed the situation instantly. Trade disputes could be negotiated. Piracy could be tolerated temporarily. But harming Roman envoys was another matter entirely. Rome considered ambassadors sacred representatives of the state. Attacking them was viewed not merely as violence, but as a direct insult to Roman authority itself. The Senate erupted with outrage. Suddenly, Illyria was no longer a distant nuisance across the Adriatic. It had become an enemy worthy of military action. Roman politicians who barely knew where Illyria was located a month earlier now competed to sound the most offended. War preparations began almost immediately. For Tutor, the confrontation she may have hoped to contain had now become something far larger. Rome was coming across the sea. For centuries, the Adriatic Sea had acted as a barrier between the Italian peninsula and the wild lands to the east. Rome had fought countless enemies on land, but now the Republic prepared for something different. A large military expedition across the sea against Tota and the Illyrian kingdom. The Roman Senate moved quickly after the death of its ambassador. War was declared, ships were assembled, and 2 consuls were appointed to lead the campaign. Rome understood that piracy alone was not the true issue anymore. The Republic wanted to send a message to every kingdom surrounding the Mediterranean. Harming Roman representatives would bring consequences. Very large consequences carried by heavily armed men. In 229 before Christ, a massive Roman fleet crossed the Adriatic. Ancient sources describe hundreds of ships transporting soldiers, supplies, and siege equipment toward the Illyrian coast. For many Greek cities living under fear of Illyrian raids, the Roman arrival looked almost miraculous. Rome, meanwhile, likely saw itself as a noble protector of trade and order. Empires are often excellent at describing expansion as public service. Tota may not have expected such a large response. Illyrian naval tactics worked well against merchant vessels and smaller enemies, but Rome possessed enormous resources and military discipline. The Republic could replace ships, recruit new soldiers, and sustain long campaigns in ways smaller kingdoms struggled to match. What had once been a regional conflict was now becoming a test of endurance against one of the most relentless states in ancient history. As the Romans advanced along the coast, several cities quickly surrendered or switched allegiance. Greek colonies welcomed Roman protection, hoping finally to escape Illyrian pressure. Some Illyrian leaders also defected, including Demetrius of Pharos, a powerful commander who abandoned Tutor and sided with Rome. Betrayal, as usual, remained one of the Mediterranean's most reliable political traditions. Roman forces captured important ports one after another. Their fleet secured coastal waters while legions advanced inland. Tutor's authority began to weaken rapidly as allies reconsidered their loyalty. A ruler feared for strength could lose support very quickly once defeat appeared possible. Still, resistance continued. Illyrian warriors defended strongholds along the rocky coastline, using the difficult terrain to slow Roman advances. Battles erupted near fortified settlements overlooking the sea, where narrow mountain passes and steep cliffs made fighting brutal and chaotic. Roman soldiers, accustomed to organized warfare, suddenly found themselves campaigning in harsh, unfamiliar territory, where enemies could strike from hillsides and vanish into forests. But despite local resistance, the momentum clearly belonged to Rome. The Republic had crossed the Adriatic successfully, and it had no intention of leaving quietly. One of the first major targets of the Roman campaign was the island of Corcyra, known today as Corfu. Positioned near the entrance of the Adriatic Sea, it was strategically vital for controlling naval movement between Greece and Illyria. Whoever held Corcyra controlled one of the region's most important maritime gateways. In ancient warfare, geography often mattered more than speeches, though politicians still insisted on making speeches anyway. At the time, Corcyra had fallen under the influence of Tutor and her commanders. The island served as both a naval base and a symbol of Illyrian power across the Adriatic. Its harbours sheltered raiding ships, while its position allowed Illyrian fleets to monitor merchant traffic moving south toward Greek waters. The defence of Corcyra had been entrusted to Demetrius of Pharos, one of Teutor's most capable commanders. Intelligent, ambitious, and politically flexible in the way many ancient nobles mysteriously became whenever survival was involved, Demetrius watched the Roman invasion carefully. He understood that Rome was not merely another rival kingdom conducting temporary raids. Rome intended to dominate. As the Roman fleet approached Corcyra, Demetrius made his decision. Rather than resisting, he surrendered the island to the Romans and switched sides entirely. It was a devastating betrayal for Teutor. Corcyra fell without a major battle, giving Rome a secure base of operations almost immediately after crossing the Adriatic. Roman commanders rewarded Demetrius generously, proving once again that betrayal in ancient politics was often less dangerous than loyalty. The surrender sent shockwaves through the region. Greek cities that had feared Illyrian dominance now rushed to support Rome. Some opened their gates willingly, others offered supplies and naval assistance. The Roman campaign was beginning to look less like a difficult overseas war, and more like a rapidly expanding liberation movement, at least from the perspective of Rome's new allies. For Teutor, however, the situation became increasingly dangerous. Her naval advantage was shrinking. Important coastal positions were falling. Worse still, Roman diplomacy was proving nearly as effective as Roman military force. By offering protection and favourable treatment, Rome encouraged local rulers to abandon Illyria voluntarily rather than fight to destruction. Meanwhile, Roman ships tightened control over Adriatic waters. Merchant traffic slowly resumed under Roman protection, weakening the economic power that piracy had once provided to the Illyrians. Teutor still controlled strongholds along the coast, but the balance of the war had changed dramatically. The Adriatic was no longer hers alone, and Rome was only getting started. As Roman forces pushed deeper into Illyrian territory, Teutor withdrew toward the inland stronghold of Scodra, one of the kingdom's most important cities. Surrounded by rivers, hills, and rugged terrain, Scodra was difficult to approach and even harder to besiege. It stood as a final symbol of Illyrian resistance, while Roman armies tightened their grip across the region. For the Romans, capturing Scodra meant more than military victory. It meant crushing Teutor's authority completely. The campaign had already exposed the weaknesses of the Illyrian kingdom. Tribal alliances that once appeared solid were beginning to fracture. Some local leaders surrendered without resistance. Others secretly negotiated with Rome while publicly claiming loyalty to Teutor. Ancient politics had a remarkable tendency to resemble a banquet, where everyone smiled politely while quietly reaching for knives under the table. Still, many Illyrians continued fighting fiercely. The Roman advance inland proved slower and more exhausting than coastal victories had suggested. Narrow mountain paths, dense forests, and sudden ambushes created constant danger for Roman troops unfamiliar with the terrain. Illyrian warriors knew the land intimately and used fast raids to harass supply lines and isolated units. The fighting became less organised and far more brutal. At Scodra, tension filled the city. Refugees crowded behind the walls. Supplies became increasingly limited. Warriors prepared defences while rumours spread constantly through the streets. Some claimed Rome intended to destroy the city entirely. Others believed Teutor would somehow gather a final fleet and drive the invaders back into the sea. Hope and fear mixed together daily, usually alongside smoke, exhaustion, and the sound of arguments over food. Meanwhile, the Romans methodically tightened the siege. Roman commanders understood patience better than most ancient armies. Their strength came not only from battlefield victories, but from relentless pressure. They built fortified camps, secured nearby roads, and slowly isolated enemy strongholds until surrender became almost inevitable. Rome often defeated enemies less through dramatic heroics, and more through organised persistence, which, admittedly, sounds far less exciting carved into a marble monument. Teutor faced an impossible situation. Her fleet had been weakened. Key allies had defected. Roman diplomacy continued eroding support among neighbouring cities. Even if Scodra resisted temporarily, the larger war was slipping away. Eventually, Teutor realised continued resistance could lead to complete destruction. So the Illyrian queen, who had once terrified Adriatic merchants and challenged Roman authority, prepared to negotiate. Not from a position of strength, but from survival. By the end of the campaign, the reality facing Teuta was impossible to ignore. Roman fleets controlled much of the Adriatic coastline, key cities had surrendered, and former allies now openly cooperated with the Republic. The Illyrian kingdom that had once dominated regional waters was shrinking rapidly under Roman pressure. Teuta understood that continuing the war could destroy what remained of her rule entirely, so she sued for peace. Ancient historians describe the surrender as humiliating but practical. Teuta agreed to Roman terms in order to preserve at least part of her kingdom and protect the young Prince Pines, whose future still depended on the survival of the royal line. The Romans, meanwhile, wanted a decisive political victory more than endless mountain warfare in hostile terrain. Conquering every hill and valley of Illyria would have been expensive, exhausting, and deeply inconvenient for men who preferred returning home to celebrate victories in parades. The peace terms were severe. Teuta was forced to pay tribute to Rome and abandon large portions of her territory. More importantly, her naval power was dramatically restricted. She could no longer sail south of a certain point in the Adriatic, with more than a small number of unarmed ships. For a ruler whose influence depended heavily on maritime strength, this was devastating. Rome had effectively broken Illyrian dominance at sea. Several Greek cities were placed under Roman protection, while Rome established influence over coastal regions that had previously operated outside its control. Though the Republic did not yet fully annex Illyria, the balance of power across the Adriatic had changed permanently. Teuta herself faded from the historical record soon afterward. Ancient writers provide only fragments about her later life. Some claim she eventually abdicated. Others suggest she remained a minor ruler under Roman supervision. History often treats defeated enemies harshly, especially women who challenged major powers. Roman historians, writing from the perspective of victory, portrayed Teuta as reckless and arrogant. Conveniently, Roman writers rarely described Roman expansion using those same adjectives. Yet despite her defeat, Teuta had accomplished something remarkable. She became one of the first rulers to force Rome into a major military expedition across the Adriatic Sea. Her conflict with the Republic marked the beginning of Roman involvement in the Balkans and Greece. What began as a struggle against piracy soon opened the door to centuries of Roman expansion eastward. In many ways, the First Illyrian War was about far more than raided merchant ships. It was Rome testing the waters of empire, quite literally. The defeat of Teuta did more than end a regional conflict. It changed the direction of Roman ambition forever. Before the Illyrian Wars, Rome had focused mainly on the Italian peninsula and nearby rivals. After crossing the Adriatic successfully, however, the Republic realized something important. The eastern Mediterranean was vulnerable, and vulnerable places had a mysterious tendency to attract Roman legions. The victory against Illyria gave Rome influence over Greek coastal cities, safer trade routes across the Adriatic, and valuable naval experience far from Italy. Roman commanders learned how to transport armies overseas, maintain supply lines across open water, and intervene politically in foreign kingdoms. These lessons would prove extremely useful in the coming centuries, especially when Rome began involving itself in Greek politics with the subtlety of a battering ram. Meanwhile, the Greek world watched nervously. Many Greek city-states initially welcomed Roman intervention against Illyrian piracy. Rome appeared disciplined, organized, and useful against regional threats. Some cities even viewed the Republic as a potential protector against more dangerous enemies such as Macedon. This would later become one of history's classic strategic miscalculations. Inviting Rome into your affairs often resembled inviting a wolf into your sheep pasture, because another wolf seemed unpleasant. Rome also gained prestige. The Republic had demonstrated that it could project military power beyond Italy and defeat enemies across the sea. Roman politicians celebrated the campaign as proof of Roman superiority, while merchants enjoyed safer Adriatic trade. Piracy decreased temporarily, though humanity's long relationship with stealing things from boats remained far from over. For the Illyrians, however, the consequences were severe. The kingdom fragmented after Teuta's defeat. Some territories remained semi-independent under rulers loyal to Rome. Others became increasingly vulnerable to future invasions. Though Illyrian resistance would continue for generations, especially under later leaders such as Gentius, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Rome now stood as the dominant force along the Adriatic coast, and once Rome established influence somewhere, it rarely left willingly. Within decades, Roman armies would intervene repeatedly in Greece, Macedon, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. Wars that supposedly began to protect allies or secure trade slowly transformed into permanent conquest. Provincial governors, Roman taxes, and imperial administration followed closely behind. The conflict with Teuta had opened the first major gateway eastward. A pirate queen defending Illyrian power had unintentionally helped begin Rome's transformation from a regional republic into a Mediterranean empire. The Adriatic had been crossed. The rest of the ancient world would soon feel the consequences. Today, Teuta survives somewhere between history and legend. Ancient Roman writers remembered her as a dangerous pirate ruler whose aggression forced Rome to act. In parts of the Balkans, however, she became a symbol of resistance, independence, and Illyrian identity. Like many figures defeated by powerful empires, her reputation depended heavily on who was telling the story. Roman historians portrayed Teuta as impulsive and reckless. According to their accounts, she underestimated Roman power, encouraged piracy, and allowed arrogance to guide her decisions. But Roman sources were written by the victors, and Rome had a habit of describing enemies in ways that conveniently justified conquest. Strangely enough, Roman expansion was always described as necessary, civilized, and noble. Entirely coincidental, of course. The reality was likely more complicated. Teuta ruled in a brutal political world where naval raids, shifting alliances, and displays of strength were normal parts of survival. Illyria was not a peaceful kingdom suddenly corrupted by piracy. Maritime raiding had existed in the Adriatic long before her reign, and would continue long afterward. What changed was Rome's growing intolerance for anything interfering with its trade, influence, or pride. And Roman pride required constant feeding. Despite her eventual defeat, Teuta accomplished something few rulers of her time managed to do. She forced Rome to respond seriously. The Republic mobilized fleets, launched a massive overseas expedition, and permanently expanded its influence because of the conflict with her kingdom. In many ways, Teuta stood at the turning point between two eras. The final years when Adriatic tribes could challenge larger Mediterranean powers, and the beginning of unstoppable Roman expansion. Her story also remains unusual, because she was a woman ruling openly in a world dominated almost entirely by male kings, generals, and senators. Ancient societies often distrusted female rulers, especially those connected to war. A queen commanding ships and confronting Rome directly disturbed many Roman writers, who seemed personally offended by the concept. History has always been filled with powerful men calmly destroying entire regions while accusing ambitious women of being dangerously emotional. Over time, legends surrounding Teuta only grew. Stories claimed she threw herself from a cliff after her defeat, or vanished into isolation near the Adriatic coast. Whether true or not, such tales reflect how deeply her memory remained rooted in local tradition. Centuries later, Rome itself would fall. Its marble forums would crumble, its emperors disappear, and its empire fracture apart. But the name Teuta endured along the Adriatic shores she once ruled, where the sea still crashes against the same rocky coastline that once carried her ships into history. Long before Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, long before European maps even pretended to understand the shape of the world, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson was growing up among glaciers, volcanic cliffs, and some of the harshest settlements in the known world. His life would eventually carry him farther west than any European before him, to the distant shores of North America. But Leif's story began not with triumph, but with exile. He was born around the late 10th century, probably in Iceland, during the great Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. His father was Eric the Red, one of the most feared and infamous Viking leaders of the age. Eric was large, aggressive, quick to anger, and possessed the unfortunate Viking habit of solving disputes with axes. Before Leif was even born, Eric's family had already been exiled from Norway after violent feuds. Then, after settling in Iceland, Eric himself was banished again for murder. This was not especially shocking by Viking standards. Norse society valued honour deeply, but it also produced an impressive number of arguments ending with someone buried in snow. The legal solution was often exile. If a man caused enough trouble, the local assembly simply informed him that he now needed to leave and become someone else's problem somewhere across the sea. So Eric sailed west with his family and followers, eventually reaching Greenland. To encourage settlers to join him, he named the frozen island Greenland, which remains one of history's greatest real estate marketing strategies. Calling it massive ice rock where your sheep will probably die likely sounded less inviting. Leif grew up in this difficult frontier world. The Greenland settlements were isolated, cold, and dangerous. Winters were brutal. Supplies were limited. Storms battered the coastline constantly. Families survived through farming, fishing, hunting, and trade with neighbouring settlements scattered along narrow fjords. Every voyage carried risk. A damaged ship or failed harvest could mean starvation. Yet Greenland also shaped Leif into an exceptional sailor. From a young age, he learned to navigate freezing seas, read dangerous weather, and survive in unforgiving conditions where hesitation often meant death. Norse children matured quickly because the environment demanded it. The Atlantic Ocean was not interested in your personal growth journey. As Leif entered adulthood, stories of distant lands beyond the western horizon already circulated among Norse sailors. And unlike most men, Leif would eventually sail far enough to find them. Growing up in Greenland shaped Leif Erikson in ways few Europeans could understand. This was not a rich kingdom with stone castles, crowded markets, or warm farmland stretching to the horizon. Greenland was isolated, cold, and unforgiving. The Norse settlements clung to narrow strips of coastal land, surrounded by towering mountains, icy waters, and endless snow. It was the kind of place where survival itself counted as a productive day, yet the settlers endured. Eric the Red ruled the Greenland colony with the authority of a powerful chieftain. His reputation alone helped maintain order among the scattered farms and villages. People respected him partly because he was successful, partly because he was dangerous, and partly because nobody wanted to test whether the stories about his temper were exaggerated. Ancient Viking politics often relied on this delicate balance. Leif grew up watching ships arrive from Iceland and Norway carrying timber, iron tools, livestock, and precious news from the outside world. Greenland lacked many basic resources, especially wood. Trees were scarce, forcing settlers to reuse timber constantly or rely on driftwood washed ashore by the sea. Imagine trying to build houses and ships while treating every piece of wood like sacred treasure. Modern furniture stores would have seemed like divine miracles. As the son of Eric the Red, Leif inherited status from birth. But Viking society respected skill as much as lineage. A chief's son still needed to prove himself through courage, seamanship, and leadership. Weakness invited humiliation quickly in Norse culture, especially among crews spending months trapped together aboard wooden ships during freezing storms. Nothing tests social harmony quite like seasickness and near starvation. Leif became known for being intelligent, calm, and capable. Unlike his father, who was remembered for his violent temper, Leif developed a reputation for thoughtful leadership. Later, Icelandic sagas often described him as wise and even-tempered, qualities that likely made him unusually pleasant by Viking standards. The average Norse gathering could become alarmingly tense after enough ale and unresolved blood feuds. During his youth, Norse exploration across the Atlantic continued expanding. Sailors travelled regularly between Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, crossing dangerous seas guided only by memory, stars, weather patterns, and experience. Maps were limited. Compasses were unknown to them. Navigation depended heavily on skill and instinct. And somewhere west of Greenland, rumours had begun spreading of lands even farther across the ocean. Stories circulated among sailors about forests, strange coastlines, and accidental sightings made during storms. Most men treated such tales cautiously. The Atlantic was filled with rumours, but Leif listened carefully, because unlike most sailors, he intended to keep sailing west. As Leif Erikson grew into adulthood, Greenland could no longer contain his ambitions. Like many young Norsemen of status, he sought experience abroad, hoping to gain wealth, reputation, and stronger political connections. In the Viking world, Remaining isolated on a remote farm for your entire life was rarely considered admirable. Adventure, trade, and occasional reckless voyages across freezing oceans were viewed as far more respectable career choices, so Leif sailed east toward Norway. The journey itself was dangerous. Crossing the North Atlantic meant enduring brutal storms, freezing winds, hidden rocks, and waves capable of destroying wooden ships in minutes. Norse longships were extraordinary vessels for their time, fast and flexible in rough seas, but they were still fragile compared to the ocean surrounding them. Viking sailors essentially crossed the Atlantic in giant wooden boats while wearing wool and optimism. When Leif finally reached Norway, he entered a very different world from Greenland's isolated settlements. Norway possessed royal courts, larger towns, organised trade networks, and growing political power under King Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf was one of the most ambitious rulers in Scandinavia, determined not only to strengthen his kingdom, but also to spread Christianity across Norse lands. This mattered greatly for Leif's future. According to the Icelandic sagas, Leif entered the service of King Olaf and became one of his trusted followers. The king reportedly admired the young Greenlander for his intelligence and character. Leif, in turn, learned valuable skills while staying at the royal court, gaining experience in diplomacy, navigation, and leadership far beyond what Greenland alone could offer. Most importantly, Leif converted to Christianity during his stay in Norway. At the time, Scandinavia stood between two worlds. The old Norse religion of Odin, Thor, and Freya still remained powerful, but Christianity was spreading rapidly through trade and royal influence. Conversion was not always peaceful. Some kings promoted Christianity through persuasion. Others preferred the deeply spiritual technique of threatening people with execution. Leif accepted baptism willingly, at least according to later Christian writers. King Olaf eventually gave Leif a mission: return to Greenland and introduce Christianity to the settlers there. It was an ambitious task. Greenland remained heavily influenced by traditional Norse beliefs, and convincing hardened Viking colonists to abandon the old gods would not be simple, especially when Thor still appeared extremely useful during thunderstorms. With gifts, royal favour, and a new faith, Leif prepared for the voyage home across the Atlantic. But before he could return to Greenland, fate, or perhaps simple Viking curiosity, would pull him toward an even greater discovery. A land far west of anything Europe officially knew existed. Before Leif Erikson ever sailed toward North America, another Norse sailor may have seen those distant shores first entirely by accident. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and unlike Leif, he had absolutely no intention of discovering a new continent. He was simply trying to visit his father, and got catastrophically lost along the way, which, in fairness, describes a surprising amount of Viking exploration. According to the Icelandic sagas, Bjarni was sailing from Iceland to Greenland when severe storms blew his ship far off course. Thick fog covered the sea for days. The crew lost all sense of direction as rough Atlantic winds carried them westward into unknown waters. Navigation in the Viking Age relied heavily on memory, sunlight, stars, and experience. Once storms removed those things, sailors were essentially negotiating with the ocean and hoping it felt cooperative. Then land appeared. Bjarni and his crew spotted unfamiliar coastlines unlike Greenland's icy terrain. They reportedly saw forested shores, rolling hills, and landscapes covered with trees. This immediately told experienced Norse sailors something extraordinary. They were no longer near Greenland. Greenland had little timber, making wood one of the colony's most valuable resources. A land filled with forests sounded almost mythical. But Bjarni made a strange decision. Rather than exploring, he refused to go ashore. His crew wanted to investigate the unknown land, but Bjarni insisted on continuing toward Greenland instead. Perhaps he feared getting stranded. Perhaps supplies were low, or perhaps he simply possessed the rare Viking personality trait of caution. Either way, he turned north and eventually reached Greenland safely, without ever landing on the mysterious western coast. When Bjarni told his story, many Greenlanders were fascinated. Among them was Leif Erikson. Leif immediately understood the importance of what Bjarni had described. A land west of Greenland containing forests and milder conditions could transform life for Norse settlers struggling with limited resources. Timber alone made the journey worthwhile, Greenland's colonists desperately needed wood for homes, tools, and shipbuilding. Leif eventually sought out Bjarni and purchased his ship, likely questioning him carefully about the route and coastlines he had seen. Unlike Bjarni, Leif had no intention of merely passing by unknown lands without investigation. Curiosity, ambition, and the Viking hunger for exploration pushed him forward. Soon, Leif assembled a crew for an expedition westward across the Atlantic. Some men joined for wealth, others sought adventure. A few probably agreed because saying no to ambitious Norse explorers in Greenland could become socially awkward very quickly. Together, they prepared to sail farther west than almost any Europeans before them, toward lands that existed only in rumour, fog, and uncertain memory. With Bjarni Herjolfsson's stories guiding him, Leif Erikson prepared for one of the most extraordinary voyages of the Viking Age. He gathered a crew of around 35 men, loaded supplies aboard Bjarni's ship, and sailed west from Greenland into waters no European expedition had intentionally explored before. The journey into the North Atlantic was dangerous even by Viking standards. Cold winds battered the ship constantly. Thick fog rolled across the sea without warning. Waves crashed against the hull day and night, while icy spray soaked sails, ropes, and exhausted sailors. Norse ships were masterpieces of craftsmanship for their time, but they still creaked and groaned under the pressure of open ocean storms. Every man aboard understood that one violent gale could erase the entire expedition without leaving so much as a floating plank behind. Yet Leif pushed onward. Unlike many Viking raids focused on conquest or plunder, this voyage carried a different purpose. Leif wanted discovery, resources, and perhaps new settlement opportunities for Greenlanders struggling to survive in a harsh environment. Timber, fertile land, and milder weather could change the future of Norse expansion across the Atlantic. Eventually, land appeared. According to the sagas, the crew first reached a rocky, barren coastline covered with flat stones and glaciers. Leif named it Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. Most historians believe this was likely Baffin Island in modern Canada. The region looked cold, harsh, and difficult for settlement. In other words, it probably reminded the Greenlanders far too much of Greenland, so they sailed onward. Farther south they encountered another coastline thick with forests, which Leif named Markland, or Forest Land. This was a remarkable discovery for Norse explorers accustomed to Greenland's lack of timber. Endless trees covered the shore, offering resources the Greenland colonies desperately needed. Modern historians usually associate Markland with Labrador. Still, Leif continued south. The climate gradually became milder. Winters seemed less severe. Rivers flowed from inland forests, and the coastline appeared more welcoming for settlement. Then the explorers reached the region that would become the most famous of all, Vinland. The sagas disagree slightly about why Leif gave it this name. Some claim wild grapes were discovered there, while others believe the word referred more generally to fertile grasslands or meadows. Either way, compared to Greenland, Vinland must have seemed astonishingly rich. After weeks crossing dangerous seas, Leif and his crew had reached North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, though they did not yet realize how enormous that discovery truly was. When Leif Erikson and his crew arrived in Vinland, they encountered a world unlike anything they had known in Greenland. The land seemed warmer, greener, and far more fertile than the harsh northern colonies they had left behind. Forests stretched across the landscape, rivers teemed with fish, and wild resources appeared abundant. After years of surviving on rocky coastlines and stubborn patches of grass, the place must have looked almost unreal. The Norse explorers built temporary shelters near the coast and settled in for the winter. According to the sagas, the environment provided plentiful food. Salmon filled the rivers. Wildlife was easier to hunt. Timber was everywhere. The Greenland settlers used to treating every usable piece of wood like sacred treasure. Vinland's forests alone were enough to make grown Vikings emotional. Leif divided his crew into groups to explore the surrounding region. Some gathered timber, others searched inland or hunted for food. The climate, though still cold by modern standards, was milder than Greenland's brutal winters. Grass remained green longer into the season, making it possible to support livestock more easily. The sagas also describe one of Leif's men, Tyrkir, discovering grapes or berries growing wild in the region. Tyrkia reportedly became so excited that the others initially feared he had lost his mind. To be fair, a Viking screaming happily in the woods after finding fruit probably looked concerning even by Norse standards. The Norse named the settlement Leifsbudir, meaning life's booths or life's camp. Modern archaeologists believe the most likely location of this settlement is Lons aux Meadows in Newfoundland, where the remains of a Norse site were discovered in the 20th century. The evidence confirmed that Vikings had indeed reached North America centuries before later European explorers. Yet Vinland was not an untouched wilderness. Though the sagas focus mostly on exploration, the Norse eventually encountered indigenous peoples whom they called Skrælings. These were likely ancestors of Native American groups living in the region. Early encounters may have involved trade, but tensions eventually developed between the Norse settlers and local inhabitants. The Norse were experienced sailors and warriors, but they remained vastly outnumbered in an unfamiliar continent, thousands of miles from home. Every damaged ship, injured man, or failed harvest increased the danger. Still, during that first winter, Vinland must have seemed full of possibility. Leif had crossed the Atlantic and found lands richer than Greenlanders could have imagined. For a brief moment, it looked as though the Viking world might expand permanently into North America. At first, Vinland appeared to offer everything the Greenland settlers could want: timber, fish, fertile land, and a climate less brutal than the icy North Atlantic colonies. But as later Norse expeditions soon discovered, surviving permanently in North America would be far more difficult than simply reaching it. After Leif Erikson returned to Greenland, news of Vinland spread quickly through Norse communities. Other explorers became eager to sail west themselves, hoping for wealth, land, and prestige. Among them were Leif's relatives, including his brother Thorvald Eriksson. Thorvald led one of the first follow-up expeditions to Vinland. Using Leif's settlement as a base, his crew explored farther along the coastline. At first, the region seemed peaceful. Then they encountered indigenous inhabitants, whom the Norse sagas referred to as Skrælings. The exact meaning of the term remains debated, but the encounters quickly became hostile. According to the sagas, Thorvald's men discovered local inhabitants sleeping beneath overturned skin boats and attacked them. One escaped. Soon afterward, larger groups returned and fought back against the Norse. During the conflict, Thorvald was struck by an arrow and killed, becoming one of the first known Europeans to die in conflict on North American soil. The moment revealed an uncomfortable truth. Vinland was not empty land waiting quietly for Norse settlers to claim it. People already lived there, understood the terrain far better than the newcomers, and would resist foreign intrusion when threatened. This was a lesson European powers would continue relearning for centuries with remarkable consistency. Other expeditions followed, including one led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, who attempted a more serious settlement effort. For a time, trade occurred between the Norse and indigenous groups. The Norse exchanged cloth and metal goods for animal pelts and local products, but mistrust lingered constantly beneath the surface. Small misunderstandings could become deadly quickly. The Norse were heavily dependent on fragile supply lines across the Atlantic. They were isolated, few in number, and vulnerable. Indigenous groups, meanwhile, greatly outnumbered them and could strike suddenly against small settlements or travelling crews. The distance from Greenland and Norway also created enormous logistical problems. Every expedition required ships, supplies, manpower, and favourable weather. A single damaged vessel could trap settlers permanently. Slowly, the dream of Vinland began to fade. The land itself was rich, but maintaining a permanent colony proved too dangerous and difficult for the Norse world to sustain. Unlike later European empires, the Vikings lacked the population and centralised power needed for large overseas colonisation. Vinland would remain a distant outpost at the edge of memory, and Leif Erikson's discovery would gradually pass into legend. By the time later, Vinland expeditions struggled against distance, isolation, and conflict. Leif Erikson himself had already become a respected figure throughout the Norse Atlantic world. Unlike many Viking leaders remembered mainly for warfare and destruction, Leif earned a reputation for exploration, leadership, and unusual good fortune. The sagas eventually gave him the nickname Leif the Lucky. Part of this reputation came from an event during his return voyage from Norway to Greenland. According to the stories, Leif encountered shipwrecked sailors stranded at sea and rescued them from certain death. In Norse society, where the ocean regularly swallowed entire crews without mercy, such an act earned enormous respect. Sailors understood better than anyone that survival often depended on the kindness of strangers and the mood of the sea. Of course, luck in Viking storytelling rarely meant simple chance. To the Norse, luck reflected personal destiny, strength of character, and divine favour. A lucky man succeeded repeatedly because fate itself seemed to move beside him. Unlucky men, meanwhile, usually ended up freezing somewhere in the North Atlantic. While everyone else composed poems about the survivors, Leif also became important for another reason: Christianity. After returning from Norway, he brought the Christian faith to Greenland, following the mission given to him by King Olaf Tryggvason. This created tension within the settlements. Many Greenlanders still worshipped the Old Norse gods, especially Thor, Odin, and Freyja. Viking religion was deeply woven into daily life, and abandoning it entirely did not happen overnight. Leif's own mother, Thjodild, converted enthusiastically, and even built one of Greenland's earliest churches near the family estate at Brattahlid. Eric the Red, however, reportedly disliked Christianity and refused conversion for much of his life. Family dinners at the Eriksson household were likely fascinating. Nothing strengthens domestic harmony quite like theological disagreements between exiled Viking warlords. Despite these tensions, Christianity slowly spread through the Greenland settlements. Leif's growing status helped legitimize the new religion among Norse colonists. He represented both worlds in many ways: the old Viking spirit of exploration and adventure, and the new Christian influence reshaping Scandinavia during the 11th century. Meanwhile, stories of Vinland continued circulating through Iceland and Greenland. Sailors spoke of forests beyond the Western Ocean, rich coastlines, and lands warmer than Greenland. Over time, however, these stories blended with legend. Europe gradually forgot the true scale of Leif's achievement. Nearly 5 centuries later, Christopher Columbus would sail west believing he had reached Asia, unaware that a Greenland Viking had crossed the Atlantic long before him. For centuries after his death, Leif Erikson existed mostly in scattered Norse sagas, remembered as a daring explorer who sailed farther west than any European before him. Outside Iceland and Greenland, however, much of Europe forgot his story entirely. Medieval kingdoms rose and collapsed, trade routes shifted, and the memory of Vinland slowly faded into legend. Meanwhile, history moved on without realizing North America had already been reached once before. The Norse settlements in Greenland gradually weakened over the following centuries. Harsh climate changes, isolation, declining trade, and conflict all contributed to their eventual disappearance. Vinland itself was abandoned long before it could become a permanent colony. The Atlantic crossing remained too dangerous, and the Norse population too small to sustain lasting expansion into North America. Yet the stories survived. Icelandic sagas preserved accounts of Leif's voyages, though many later scholars treated them as myths or exaggerated folklore. Medieval storytelling often blended history with legend so naturally that separating truth from fiction became difficult. One paragraph might describe careful navigation across the Atlantic, while the next casually included prophecies, ghosts, or a man wrestling undead creatures inside a burial mound. Viking literature believed firmly in keeping readers emotionally prepared for absolutely anything. Then, in the 20th century, archaeology changed everything. At Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, researchers uncovered the remains of a genuine Norse settlement dating back roughly 1,000 years. Turf buildings, ironworking evidence, Norse artifacts, and construction styles confirmed that Viking explorers had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus. The discovery stunned historians. Leif Erikson was no longer simply a figure from legend. He became recognized as one of history's greatest explorers, a man who crossed the Atlantic using only Viking ships, experience, memory, and extraordinary courage. No modern maps, no advanced instruments, just cold oceans, uncertain weather, and the deeply Norse belief that the horizon probably contained something worth finding. Today, Leif stands as a symbol of exploration across Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and North America. Statues of him overlook harbours and cities from Iceland to the United States. In modern memory, he He represents the adventurous spirit of the Viking Age far more than its violence. Still, his achievement remains astonishing even now. A sailor born in a remote Greenland colony reached the shores of North America nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, then returned home to tell the tale, and for a brief moment in history, Viking ships rested on the edge of a continent Europe would not truly rediscover again for generations. In the heart of ancient Babylon, surrounded by dry plains, scorching winds, and endless sun-baked brick, there once stood a wonder so extraordinary that travellers struggled to describe it properly. Towering terraces covered in trees, flowers, flowing water, and hanging vines supposedly rose above the city walls like an artificial mountain of green. This was the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or at least, that is what ancient writers claimed. The gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though historians still debate whether they truly existed exactly as described. Ancient accounts were written centuries later by Greek and Roman authors who never actually saw them, which is slightly concerning when discussing one of history's greatest engineering projects. Imagine historians in 2,000 years trying to reconstruct modern cities entirely from overheard airport conversations. Still, the legend endured. Most stories connect the gardens to King Nebuchadnezzar II, ruler of Babylon during the 6th century before Christ. Under his reign, Babylon became one of the richest and most powerful cities in the ancient world. Massive walls surrounded the city. Temples towered above crowded streets. Processional roads displayed brilliant glazed bricks painted with lions and dragons. The Euphrates River flowed directly through the heart of the empire, feeding trade, agriculture, and life itself. Yet according to tradition, one person remained unhappy. Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis of Media, supposedly missed the green mountains and forests of her homeland. Babylon, despite its wealth, was flat, dry, and overwhelmingly dusty. Ancient Mesopotamian summers were brutally hot, the kind of heat that makes every physical task feel like a personal insult from the gods. So the king ordered something extraordinary. He commanded engineers, labourers, architects, gardeners, and slaves to construct an enormous artificial paradise rising above the desert itself. Layer upon layer of terraces would support trees, exotic plants, flowing water, and shaded walkways high above the city streets. The project would require massive foundations, advanced irrigation systems, and endless labour. Most importantly, it would require water, an impossible amount of water. Keeping ordinary crops alive in Mesopotamia already demanded constant irrigation from canals and rivers. Maintaining elevated gardens filled with trees and hanging plants in the middle of Babylon would push ancient engineering to its limits. Every drop lifted upward had to come from somewhere, and in the ancient world, moving water uphill was one of the hardest problems imaginable, especially when your technology mostly involved ropes, bronze tools, and very exhausted workers. In the ancient city of Babylon, where the sun-baked mud-brick walls beneath relentless heat and dust drifted constantly through crowded streets, there supposedly stood one of the most astonishing creations of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. According to legend, enormous green terraces rose high above the city like an artificial mountain. Trees shaded elevated walkways. Vines spilled downward over stone walls. Water flowed through hidden channels while flowers bloomed above the desert heat. Travellers claimed the gardens looked less like ordinary architecture and more like nature itself had somehow been lifted into the sky. If the stories were true, the sight must have been unbelievable. Babylon was already one of the richest cities on earth during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before Christ. Massive defensive walls surrounded the city. Temples towered over marketplaces crowded with merchants, priests, labourers and soldiers. The processional way dazzled visitors with glazed blue bricks decorated with lions and dragons. At night, torchlight reflected off palace walls while the Euphrates River cut directly through the empire's heart. Yet Babylon remained a city of heat and dry plains. The surrounding landscape lacked the cool forests and mountains found farther north and east. Ancient Mesopotamian summers were brutal. Dust storms swept across the land. Shade was precious. Water determined survival itself. In this environment, a giant elevated garden overflowing with greenery would have seemed almost supernatural. Ancient writers later claimed the gardens were built for Queen Amytis, wife of Nebuchadnezzar. She supposedly came from Media, a mountainous region filled with forests and green hills. Far from her homeland, she missed the landscapes of her childhood. So the king ordered the construction of a vast paradise, meant to recreate the mountains she longed for. Whether the story is entirely true remains uncertain. No surviving Babylonian text directly describes the gardens in detail, and modern historians still debate whether they existed exactly as ancient Greeks later described them. Some scholars even believe the gardens may have been located in Nineveh rather than Babylon. Ancient historians occasionally demonstrated a deeply inspiring commitment to geographical confusion. Still, the legend survived because the idea itself was unforgettable. To build towering gardens in the middle of Mesopotamia required extraordinary engineering. Massive terraces needed to support tons of wet soil and heavy trees. Hidden waterproofing systems had to prevent collapse. Most difficult of all, enormous quantities of water needed to be lifted upward constantly from the river below, and every bucket of water carried upward came through human labour. Thousands upon thousands of exhausting trips beneath the Babylonian sun. If the hanging gardens of Babylon truly existed, they were only one part of a far larger transformation taking place under Nebuchadnezzar II. During his reign, Babylon became the greatest city in Mesopotamia and one of the most magnificent capitals of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar inherited a powerful empire, but he wanted more than military victories. He wanted permanence, glory carved into brick and stone, a city so impressive that foreign ambassadors would feel small the moment they entered its gates. Ancient kings rarely believed in modesty. If they built something, it needed to scream, "I am favoured by the gods," from several miles away, and Babylon certainly did. The king ordered enormous construction projects throughout the city. Massive defensive walls were expanded and reinforced. Temples rose toward the sky. Palaces spread across large sections of the capital. The famous Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant blue-glazed bricks decorated with lions, bulls and dragons, became one of the most spectacular entrances in the ancient world. Foreign visitors entering Babylon likely felt overwhelmed immediately. The city was crowded, noisy and alive with movement. Merchants sold spices, grain, cloth and precious metals from across the Near East. Priests carried offerings through temple courtyards heavy with incense. Scribes scratched records onto clay tablets, while labourers hauled bricks endlessly through dusty streets. Everywhere stood evidence of imperial wealth and centralised power. At the centre of all this construction stood the Euphrates River. The river was Babylon's lifeline. It supplied water for drinking, farming, trade, transportation and industry. Canals spread outward across Mesopotamia like veins carrying life into dry land. Without irrigation, the surrounding region would quickly return to harsh desert plains. This dependence on water made the idea of elevated gardens even more extraordinary. Keeping ordinary crops alive already required careful irrigation systems maintained constantly by workers and engineers. Building enormous terraces filled with trees high above the ground multiplied the challenge dramatically. Soil becomes incredibly heavy when wet. Trees require enormous amounts of water. One engineering mistake could collapse entire sections of the structure. Yet Nebuchadnezzar possessed something many rulers lacked: resources. His empire controlled trade routes, armies, farmland, and thousands of labourers. Prisoners of war, slaves, craftsmen, engineers, and common workers all contributed to Babylon's expansion. Day after day, brick after brick, the city grew larger and more ambitious beneath the Mesopotamian sun, and somewhere within this expanding imperial capital, plans for the gardens began taking shape, not simply as decoration, but as a statement of royal power over nature itself. Constructing the hanging gardens of Babylon required far more than planting trees on palace rooftops. If ancient descriptions are even partially accurate, the builders were attempting something almost unimaginable for their time: creating an artificial mountain of stone, brick, soil, and water in the middle of flat Mesopotamian terrain. And they had to do it without modern machinery. No cranes powered by engines, no steel frameworks, no electric pumps, just ramps, ropes, pulleys, mud brick, human labour, and endless determination, fueled partly by royal authority and partly by the fear of disappointing Nebuchadnezzar II. The first challenge was the foundation. The gardens would need to support enormous weight, thick layers of soil, heavy trees, flowing water, and stone terraces all pressed downward constantly. Builders likely constructed massive vaulted platforms made from baked brick and stone columns, capable of carrying tremendous pressure. Ancient engineers understood surprisingly advanced structural techniques, even if their workplace safety regulations mostly consisted of "try not to die under the collapsing bricks." The terraces rose upward in levels. Each platform may have supported different types of plants, from flowers and shrubs to large shade trees. Ancient writers described greenery spilling downward over the edges of the terraces, creating the illusion of hanging gardens suspended above the city streets. Seen from below, the structure may have resembled a green mountain rising above Babylon's dry landscape. But beneath all that beauty existed brutal labour. Thousands of workers hauled mud brick, stone, timber and soil under intense Mesopotamian heat. Labour gangs carried materials up ramps constantly while overseers organised construction crews. Some workers were likely skilled craftsmen and engineers. Others were slaves or prisoners captured during Babylonian military campaigns. The empire's beauty rested heavily on exhausted shoulders. Transporting fertile soil alone would have been a nightmare. Good soil had to be brought into the city, lifted upward onto terraces, and maintained constantly against erosion and dryness. Then came the trees. Mature trees weighed enormous amounts and required deep planting areas strong enough to support spreading roots without damaging the structure underneath. Worst of all was the water problem. Every terrace required irrigation daily. Mesopotamian heat could dry exposed soil quickly, especially high above ground where sunlight and wind struck constantly. Without continuous watering, the gardens would wither into dead branches and dust within weeks. Somewhere inside the structure, engineers needed a hidden system capable of lifting river water upward again and again every single day, a mechanical heartbeat feeding an artificial paradise. Because without water, the hanging gardens would not have been a wonder at all, just a very expensive pile of dying plants. For all the beauty associated with the hanging gardens of Babylon, the true miracle may not have been the plants or terraces at all. It was the water. Keeping elevated gardens alive in the middle of Mesopotamia required an enormous and constant supply of irrigation. Trees, flowers, vines and shrubs consumed vast amounts of water beneath the Babylonian sun. Without continuous moisture, the terraces would dry out quickly, turning paradise into a collection of very expensive dead roots. So the builders needed to solve one of the ancient world's hardest engineering problems: how to move water uphill every day without interruption. Ancient writers described hidden machinery inside the structure itself. Though details remain uncertain, many historians believe the Babylonians may have used chain pumps, screw-like lifting devices, or systems of buckets attached to rotating mechanisms. Workers or animals could power the machinery continuously, lifting water upward from the Euphrates River through concealed shafts inside the terraces. The process would have been exhausting. Imagine standing for hours in brutal heat, turning heavy wooden mechanisms while water sloshed endlessly upward through clay-lined channels. Day after day, week after week, ancient wonders often inspire admiration today, because modern people rarely imagine the sweating labourers trapped behind the scenery. Once lifted upward, the water likely flowed through a network of canals and stone channels beneath the terraces. Engineers had to distribute it carefully so every level received enough moisture without flooding the structure or weakening the foundations. Too little water meant dying plants. Too much meant structural collapse. Ancient engineers essentially balanced a small artificial ecosystem above a royal palace using mathematics, observation, and cautious optimism. Waterproofing became another major challenge. Mud brick dissolved easily when exposed to moisture over long periods. To protect the structure, builders reportedly layered stone slabs, reeds, asphalt-like bitumen, and lead sheets beneath the soil. These barriers prevented water from seeping downward and damaging the terraces below. The Babylonians understood that a leaking irrigation system hanging above crowded palace rooms could create what modern engineers technically describe as a catastrophic situation. The higher the gardens rose, the more difficult the problem became. Heavy water channels increased pressure on the terraces, roots spread deeper over time. Summer heat accelerated evaporation constantly. Workers had to maintain pumps, repair channels, replace damaged plants, and monitor the entire system continuously. The gardens were not a static monument. They were alive, and like all living things, they demanded endless care. Somewhere behind the beauty of flowing vines and shaded walkways existed crews of unseen workers hauling water upward hour after hour, so the king's artificial paradise would continue blooming above the desert. To foreign visitors, the hanging gardens of Babylon may have looked effortless. Water flowed gracefully across terraces, trees swayed above the city walls, exotic flowers bloomed in carefully arranged layers, while cool shade sheltered royal walkways from the Mesopotamian heat. But beneath that beauty existed relentless labour. Ancient wonders were not built by kings alone. They were built by thousands of workers whose names vanished from history almost immediately after the bricks dried. The hanging gardens, if they truly existed as described, would have required an enormous workforce operating constantly behind the scenes. Labourers carried bricks under scorching sun. Engineers supervised foundations and irrigation systems. Gardeners trimmed plants and replaced dying vegetation. Water carriers hauled endless loads upward through ramps and stairways. Slaves and prisoners of war likely performed much of the harshest work, especially during the massive construction projects ordered by Nebuchadnezzar II. The Babylonian Empire had no shortage of forced labour. Military campaigns brought captives from conquered regions across the Near East. These prisoners often became part of state construction projects, building temples, canals, palaces, and defensive walls throughout the empire. Ancient rulers celebrated great monuments proudly, while remaining surprisingly quiet about the people collapsing from exhaustion nearby. The work itself was brutal. Mesopotamian summers were oppressively hot. Temperatures soared beneath open sunlight while workers hauled stone, soil, timber, and water through dusty construction zones. Mud brick buildings trapped heat during the day, creating suffocating conditions around active work sites. Shade was limited. Clean water mattered constantly. Injuries were common. And the gardens never truly stopped demanding labour. Unlike a stone monument completed once and left standing, the gardens required continuous maintenance every single day. Plants died. Irrigation channels clogged. Roots damaged structures. Soil eroded during heavy watering. Pumps wore down from constant use. Entire crews likely worked permanently within the gardens simply to keep the system functioning. Then there were the plants themselves. The terraces may have contained trees and flowers imported from distant parts of the empire. Transporting foreign plants across deserts and rivers required careful planning. Gardeners needed knowledge of irrigation, soil conditions, and seasonal changes to keep delicate species alive far from their native climates. To the royal family, the gardens represented beauty and prestige. To the workers maintaining them, they represented endless responsibility. Every morning, water still needed lifting, dead plants still needed replacing, cracked channels still needed repairs. The paradise above Babylon survived only because unseen labourers continued feeding it with sweat, strength, and exhaustion. Ancient wonders often appear timeless in stories. In reality, they survived day by day through human effort that never truly ended. Once completed, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon became more than an engineering achievement. They became a symbol of royal power, wealth, and control over nature itself. Rising above the dry plains of Mesopotamia, the terraces transformed part of Babylon into an artificial paradise reserved largely for the king, his court, and favoured guests. For ordinary Babylonians working in crowded streets below, the gardens must have seemed almost unreal. Imagine walking through dusty marketplaces beneath blazing heat, while high above you, waterfalls flowed through shaded terraces filled with trees and flowers imported from distant lands. Ancient inequality rarely bothered with subtlety. Kings preferred their luxury displayed openly, where everyone could admire it and quietly resent it at the same time. The royal family likely used the gardens as both a private retreat and a political stage. Foreign ambassadors visiting Babylon would be guided through cool pathways lined with exotic plants, while servants carried food, wine, and perfumes beneath shaded pavilions. Water channels produced soothing sounds throughout the terraces, while birds nested among branches far above the city noise. Every detail communicated the same message. Babylon possessed enough wealth and engineering skill to create forests where forests should not exist. The symbolism mattered deeply. Mesopotamian civilization depended entirely on controlling water and agriculture. Kings were expected to maintain canals, irrigation systems, and fertile farmland across the empire. A ruler who provided abundance demonstrated divine favour and political legitimacy. The gardens therefore represented more than decoration. They showcased the king's mastery over the environment itself. Nature had been reorganized according to imperial command. Ancient writers described trees growing high above vaulted terraces, with streams flowing down between levels like mountain springs. If true, the experience would have contrasted sharply with the surrounding plains of Mesopotamia. Visitors entering the gardens may have felt as though they had stepped into another world entirely. The sense alone would have been remarkable. Cedar, cypress, myrtle, flowering plants, damp soil, fresh water and fruit trees likely filled the air. In a city dominated by sun-baked brick and dusty roads, such greenery would have felt almost miraculous, particularly to visiting diplomats who had just spent days crossing hot desert landscapes while questioning every life decision that led them there. At night, torchlight may have reflected across pools and flowing channels, while musicians performed for nobles beneath the terraces. Royal banquets likely took place among the gardens during cooler evening hours, surrounded by imported plants from across the empire. Yet beneath the luxury remained constant fragility. The gardens only survived through endless maintenance and water flow. Without labourers operating pumps and repairing irrigation systems daily, the paradise would slowly begin dying beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Even wonders of the ancient world depended on very ordinary people keeping them alive. For all their fame, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon remain one of history's greatest mysteries. Ancient writers described them as a breathtaking wonder, rising above Babylon's streets. Yet modern archaeologists have never found clear, undeniable proof of the gardens exactly as they were described, which is slightly awkward for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Most of what we know about the gardens comes from Greek and Roman authors writing centuries after the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. Writers such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus described massive terraces, advanced irrigation systems, and elevated greenery overflowing above the city. The problem is that none of these authors actually saw the gardens themselves. Many relied on older stories, traveller accounts, or second-hand descriptions passed down over generations. Ancient historians often mixed observation with rumour surprisingly freely. One paragraph might describe engineering details carefully, while the next casually included giant mythical creatures or armies numbering in the millions. Historical precision was occasionally treated more as a suggestion. Then came the archaeological problem. Excavations in Babylon uncovered enormous walls, temples, palaces, canals, and inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Yet direct references to the Hanging Gardens remain strangely absent in surviving Babylonian records. This surprises historians because Mesopotamian kings loved documenting their achievements. Nebuchadnezzar recorded countless building projects proudly on inscriptions and clay tablets. If he truly built one of the greatest wonders on earth, many scholars wonder why he never clearly mentioned it. This has led to alternative theories. Some historians now believe the gardens may not have been located in Babylon at all. Instead, they argue the famous descriptions could actually refer to elaborate royal gardens built in the Assyrian city of Nineveh by King Sennacherib about a century earlier. Sennacherib left inscriptions describing advanced irrigation systems, artificial landscapes, and water-lifting technology, remarkably similar to later Greek descriptions of the Hanging Gardens. In other words, ancient writers may have confused 2 great Mesopotamian cities over time. Entire civilizations have disappeared because of less ambitious filing errors. Still, many historians remain cautious. The absence of evidence does not necessarily prove the gardens never existed. Structures made partly from mud brick deteriorate badly over thousands of years, especially in regions affected by flooding, war, and rebuilding. Parts of ancient Babylon also remain difficult to excavate fully. So the Hanging Gardens exist today somewhere between history and legend. Perhaps they truly rose above Babylon's skyline. Perhaps they belong to another city entirely. Or perhaps centuries of storytelling transformed ordinary royal gardens into something far grander. Either way, the mystery itself became part of their legend. Whether the Hanging Gardens of Babylon truly existed as described or not, the empire that supposedly built them did not last forever. Like every great ancient power, Babylon eventually faced the same problem that destroys nearly all empires: other ambitious empires. After the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon slowly weakened. Internal political struggles, unstable rulers, and shifting alliances began eroding the strength of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The massive building projects that once symbolized royal glory also demanded enormous resources to maintain. Palaces, canals, temples, defensive walls, and perhaps even elevated gardens all required constant labor and organization. Ancient grandeur was extremely expensive. Meanwhile, to the east, a new power was rising rapidly under Cyrus the Great. The Persian Empire expanded across Asia with astonishing speed, conquering kingdoms one after another while presenting itself not merely as a destroyer, but as a liberator and unifier, which, conveniently enough, made conquest sound much more polite. In 539 before Christ, Persian forces advanced toward Babylon. The city still possessed enormous walls and legendary defences. Greek historians later claimed Babylon's fortifications were among the strongest ever constructed. Thick walls surrounded the city while the Euphrates River flowed directly through it. To many Babylonians, the capital must have appeared invincible. History repeatedly punishes civilizations for thinking that. According to ancient accounts, Cyrus captured Babylon with surprisingly little destruction. Some stories claim Persian engineers diverted part of the Euphrates River, allowing soldiers to enter the city through lowered waterways beneath the walls. Other accounts suggest sections of the population welcomed Persian rule after dissatisfaction with Babylon's final rulers. Either way, Babylon fell. The city survived